Lord. Okay, well, today we are back to Creekside book by book, Leviticus chapter 4 through 6. And you're like, oh, we couldn't possibly talk more about sacrifices, but you're wrong. You're wrong. We could. There's so many sacrifices. The Israelites had 5 standard offerings. They had the first 3, which we talked about last week, were burnt grain and fellowship offerings. And now today we're going to look at the other 2, which are the purification offering or the sin offering and the guilt offering or reparation offering. And so these 2 go hand in hand. And so these are for atonement, forgiveness of sin, that kind of stuff, making things right. And so as we think through how the purification offering functions, when we think about impurity and sin, a little bit goes a long way. And as we walk through the law, we're going to have more explanation of what makes people impure, what classifies as sin. And we're not going to get into all of that today, but there are going to be some things that we're going to look at where it's like, if a person sins without knowing it or on accident, like those are some of the offerings that we're going to look at today. They're going to talk about that kind of thing. So there's a couple different kinds of sin. There's like sin without knowing, and then there's high-handed sin, which is what a lot of commentators call it, which is essentially like, you did it, you knew it was wrong, you did it anyway. That's a high-handed sin. But sometimes there's some things where people might feel the effects of sin and they might not know what they did, and that's when it would be a sin without knowing, or an impurity that happened on accident or something like that. And so we're going to look at some of those today. And we're going to look at different levels of people who have offense. And so the priest, the whole community, the leader, and like what each level of group does if they have some kind of impurity in their community. And one of the important things to note here as well is sin's defiling effects don't only impact the sinner individually, but it actually works its way into the whole community, those associated with the sinner, which is something that is a foreign concept to many folks in the Western world, in an American culture. The idea of cultural sin, or maybe even a corporate sin, systemic sin, those kinds of ideas are troubling. And people who, like in a culture that is very individualistic, like American culture, the idea of a systemic or corporate sin is like, well, I didn't do anything. Why should that affect me? But the way the people of Israel were living in community together, like one person's sin did ripple out to other people. And so recognizing that as part of how we read the law is an important part of this sacrificial system as well. And one more thing before we jump into the actual text, the root word for sin, and this is out of my notes. Okay, I'm going to read this. The root word for sin occurs 595 times in the Old Testament, and Leviticus, with 116 uses of that, has far more occurrences than any other Old Testament book. This section that we're going to look at has 53 uses of the root word for sin, and it is the heaviest concentration of the discussion of sin in the Bible. So we're going to really focus in on sin. You're going to hear that word a bunch, and so just buckle up. It'll be all good. And since this is all talking about the sin offering, it addresses the proper procedures for presentation of the offering among all possible groups of Israelite people. It reveals the pervasiveness of sin as a characteristic of the human condition. No religious or civil leader was so prominent that his sin was condoned, nor any man so insignificant that his sin was ignored. And so sin was not just a lower than person or high up person. It was everybody throughout the whole camp had to recognize that sin was present and to do these kinds of offerings as necessary. All right, so let's jump in to chapter 4, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, when anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, and then it starts breaking down. Like, so if anybody does this unintentional thing, if the anointed priest sins, so the high priest, bringing guilt on the people, he must bring to the Lord a young bull without defect as a sin offering for the sin he has committed. He is to present the bull at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord. He is to lay his hand on its head and slaughter it there before the Lord. Then the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and carry it into the tent of meeting. He is to dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle some of it 7 times before the Lord in front of the curtain of the sanctuary. The priest shall then put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense that is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. The rest of the bull's blood he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He shall remove all the fat from the bull of the sin offering, all the fat that is connected to the internal organs, both kidneys, with the fat on them near the loins, and the long lobe of the liver, which he will remove with the kidneys, just as the fat is removed from the ox sacrificed as a fellowship offering. Then the priest shall burn them on the altar of burnt offering, but the hide of the bull and all its flesh, as well as the head and legs, the internal organs and the intestines, that is, all the rest of the bull, he must take outside the camp to a place ceremonially clean where the ashes are thrown, and burn it there in a wood fire on the ash heap. And so here, the sinning unintentionally for the high priest could be some kind of accidental misuse of some element of the worship system. Or it could be that the priest accidentally touched something that was unclean and maybe didn't know it, and then it was revealed to him. And how the high priest would know if it was revealed to him, there may be some kind of effects from sin, some kind of consequence. The high priest also had the Urim and the Thummim, which were the ways that they could determine things, and so he could potentially, cast lots, essentially saying like, is there a sin in my life, and then let the Lord determine the yes or no through the Urim and the Thummim, which is hard to say. And so that's how he may have known that he had done that. And so the high priest's sins are pretty significant. They affect the whole community, partly because the high priest serves as the intermediary between God and the whole Israelite congregation. And so the high priest's impurity in sin doesn't just affect him, it also affects the tabernacle itself, because it is supposed to be, consecrated and pure. And so his instructions here, if the high priest does these things, is to sacrifice this, to bring the bull to the entrance of the tent, do the slaughtering, all the different things. And he is again consecrating the different elements in the tabernacle. And he's sprinkling the blood 7 times as a way of purifying the parts of the sanctuary without going to each one individually. But he is going through, like with the altar of incense, and making sure that these different things are purified. And when it's a major impurity, we're going to see later, there's a waiting period, like for leprosy and that kind of stuff, where they have to wait and see if the skin disease clears up. But this is part of the process here. Is he's consecrating himself, he's consecrating the elements of the tabernacle, and then also his offering, like he puts all the fat and the liver and those choice pieces of the bull on the altar to burn, but all the rest of it is actually taken then outside of the camp and burned on the ash heap outside of the camp, where it is ceremonially clean to do so. And so all of this is kind of a foreshadowing to the Day of Atonement, where there would be one of the goats, the scapegoat, would be sent out to out of the camp, and essentially saying like the Lord will handle that goat. And so here he's taking his impurity and the bull, and none of it's being eaten. It's only blood is being sprinkled, it's being burnt on the altar, and then it's being burnt out on the ash heap as well, separate from the rest of the camp, separate from the rest of the offerings. It's to make it all clean. And so this is part of his process to handle the sins of the high priest. And this is, for him to be forgiven and to consecrate the camp, or to consecrate the elements of the tabernacle. There are some different, I'll get to that later. Sorry, I was going ahead a little bit. So the goal of these offerings that we're going to look at, it is, forgiveness or purification. And the verb forgive in these texts, it is only God who is the subject of those sentences where someone is forgiving. God is the one forgiving, never humans. And it doesn't rule out punishment. So we must be sure to recognize that the concept of forgiveness concerns relationship rather than the judicial issue of punishment. As we walk through these, there may still be some other punishments that happen when somebody breaks one of these laws or has an impurity. But the one who is offering these sacrifices seeks reconciliation with God, not necessarily pardon from the punishment. And so that will come into play in a little bit, in a couple of chapters. So verse 13. So we went from the priest, who is a mediator for the community. So if the whole community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, even though the community is unaware of the matter, when they realize their guilt and the sin they committed becomes known, the assembly must bring a young bull as a sin offering and present it before the tent of meeting. The elders of the community are to lay their hands on the bull's head before the Lord, and the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord. Then the anointed priest is to take some of the bull's blood into the tent of meeting. He shall dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle it before the Lord 7 times in front of the curtain. He is to put some of the blood on the horns of the altar that is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. The rest of the blood he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He shall remove all the fat from it and burn it on the altar, and do with the bull just as he did with the bull for the sin offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for the community, and they will be forgiven. Then he shall take the bull outside the camp and burn it as he burned the first bull. This is the sin offering for the community. So pretty similar interaction here with the offering. But in this time, the major difference is the elders of the community, the leaders of the community, they all put their hands on the bull. And laying on of hands is like a transference symbol, an ownership symbol. And we talked about briefly last week that the sense is not just like put your hand on it, but like lean on the bull and like essentially transferring your weight onto the bull. And so here for the priest, one person, the sacrifice for one person is a bull. Here for the whole community, the sacrifice for the whole community is also a bull. And so just thinking through like the inflation rate or the economics of the sacrifice, like the severity of the high priest's impurity is the same as the severity of the whole community's impurity. And so like note those kinds of differences. And again, the blood is sprinkled on the curtain, it's put on the altar, and then it's poured out at the base, and the fat parts are burned on the altar in the tabernacle complex. The rest are taken out to the ash heap and burned there. And so removing the impurity out of the camp again. Verse 22, when a leader sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the commands of the Lord his God, when he realizes his guilt and the sin he has committed becomes known, he must bring as his offering a male goat without defect. He is to lay his hand on the goat's head and slaughter it at the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered before the Lord. It is a sin offering. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. He shall burn all the fat on the altar as he burned the fat of the fellowship offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for the leader's sin, and he will be forgiven. And so, from bull for the priest, bull for the community, now to a male goat for one leader's unintentional sin. And so, this could be an elder or even a leader of a group within a tribe. It could refer to a king, but I mean, we don't have kings set up yet. There is a hint of anticipating kings in the law, but we are not at that point yet. But that could also be part of the offering. So whereas we don't have specific instructions on where to do what to do with all of the animal, like he shall burn all the fat on the altar as he burned the fat for the fellowship offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for the leader's sin, and he will be forgiven. In the other sin offerings, no one eats the meat, but it's not a clear indication here that the whole animal is being burnt on the altar. And so, but it is still fairly similar to what is going on. Main difference is just a male goat, not a bull. And the male goat without defect. So verse 27, talking about a lot of offerings, a lot of blood. If any member of the community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, when they realize their guilt and the sin they have committed becomes known, they must bring as their offering for the sin they committed a female goat without defect. They are to lay their hand on the head of the sin offering and slaughter it at the place of the burnt offering. Then the priest is to take some of the blood with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. They shall remove all the fat, just as the fat is removed from the fellowship offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. It is in this way the priest will make atonement for them, and they will be forgiven. If someone brings a lamb as their sin offering, they are to bring a female goat without defect. A female without defect. They are to lay their hand on its head and slaughter it for the sin offering at the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar burnt offering, and of the sin offering with his finger and put a sin offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. They shall remove all the fat, just as the fat is removed from the lamb of the fellowship offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar on top of the food offerings presented to the Lord. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them for the sin they have committed, and they will be forgiven. And so here we have distinction. If ordinary citizens unintentionally sin, they can bring, instead of a bull or a male goat, they can bring a female goat or a female sheep. And there could be a whole bunch of different reasons, but it is not specified here why they would be allowed to do a female. But all these different types of sins, they're all tied to unintentional sin. So the nature of all these has been talked about a bit in all kinds of different commentaries. And one commentator in particular, Boyce, he gives a list of what these could have been, or I'll just read it. First, the unintentional nature of all these sins has been much discussed. While the proximity of the Lord in the camp may well make the commission of any intentional sin hard to imagine, any translation of this term at face value creates problems. How can a priest be ignorant of the law? How can sins like robbery, fraud, or false testimony be understood as unintentional? The best that might be said here is that these sacrifices are meant for purification and reparation regarding sins wandered into versus sins high-handedly performed. So these sins meet with the sterner measures, as do the high-handed ones meet with sterner measures, as do sins against the Holy Spirit later in Scripture. Also, second, it is essential to note the writer's assumption that all people are prone to such sin: priest, ruler, congregation, and commoner. So sin is not any one class of person's problem. It's the whole community's problem. Third, it should be no surprise that to the reader that the Bible, how cultic and non-cultic, sacred and secular sins overlap, from mishandling of holy things to deceiving one's neighbor. The melding of church and everyday business becomes even clearer in the holiness codes that follow in Leviticus 19. Fourth, the requirements of reparation offering demonstrate that one's business is only half over when the human victims have been made good with interest. And so we're going to see that they're actually going to have a percentage that goes above the cost of the offering. Like it'll be according to the tabernacle shekel, which is about 20% extra to the cost of the offering that they're bringing. And then if a solution must be found to the problem of the holy God tabernacling amid an unholy people in general, how much more is the problem exacerbated in cases of obvious breach? If all these cases, much more than taking off one's shoes or washing one's clothes, is required, this is no cheap grace, but a costly forgiveness indeed. And so the severity of sin is important for the people to recognize the holiness of God and his dwelling among them. And so the giving a bit of latitude to the people is helpful. And so we saw a little bit of the different costs of sacrifices in the last week as we got started. And we're going to see that again. But as we jump into chapter 5, we are going to see that we're going to have 4 occasions when purification offerings would be needed as examples. And so here, the Lord is speaking to the people through Moses in chapter 5, verse 1. And it's kind of a chiasm of things that have to do with word acts and then touching unclean things. So words, unclean things, words. So a chiasm. So verse 5:1, if anyone sins because they do not speak up when they hear a public charge to testify regarding something they have seen or learned about, they will be held responsible. And so what that's getting at here is the not testifying to an oath. And so if you witnessed a crime or somebody's breach of the purity codes or something like that, and the leaders of the camp say, we are looking for witnesses to this offense, and you know about it and you don't speak up, that is a cause for impurity, and that so that is a sin here. And the text here doesn't say why a witness would fail to come forward, but it could be things like complicity or shame or fear that's keeping people from speaking up. And so if they are not willing to speak up because they are a part of the problem, then it makes sense then that they would bear some of the responsibility for the issue. Pick up in verse 2. If anyone becomes aware that they are guilty, if they unwittingly touch anything ceremonially unclean, whether the carcass of an unclean animal, wild or domestic, or any of the unclean creature that move along the ground, and they are unaware that they have become unclean, but then they come to realize their guilt, or if they touch human uncleanness, anything that would make them unclean, even though they are unaware of it, but then they learn of it and realize their guilt, or if anyone thoughtlessly takes an oath to do anything, whether good or evil, in any matter one might carelessly swear about, even though they are unaware of it, but then they learn of it and realize their guilt. When anyone becomes aware that they are guilty in any of these matters, they must confess in what way they have sinned. As a penalty for their sin they have committed, they must bring to the Lord a female lamb or goat from the flock as a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for their sin. So we just talked about how unintentionally somebody might become guilty. And then right in 5 is giving us 4 examples. They don't speak up in case of a witness. They touch an unclean animal. They touch something human that makes them unclean, or they take an oath lightly. They don't fulfill the oath. And, those are important things in the community, because like, if you touch an unclean thing and you just go about your life, you're bringing that impurity with you everywhere you go. If you are not taking the words that you say seriously and taking an oath, that doesn't just affect you, that affects the whole community, because now you've broken trust with them and you are not living in a way that trusts the Lord. And so that's why these are so severe. So this thoughtless oath is, part of what the thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. That's part of what this is getting at here, is that, like, the idea of a thoughtless oath. And so they're making these promises unseriously. And so they have the similar offerings, the lamb or the female goat, right? Female lamb or female goat. But what if they can't afford those? And that's where verse 7 jumps in. Anyone who cannot afford a lamb is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons to the Lord as a penalty for their sin, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. They are to bring them to the priest, who shall first offer the one for the sin offering. He is to wring its head off from its neck, not dividing it completely, and is to splash some of the blood of the sin offering against the side of the altar. The rest of the blood must be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. The priest shall then offer the other as a burnt offering in the prescribed way and make atonement for them for the sin they have committed, and they will be forgiven. If, however, they cannot afford 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, they are to bring as an offering for their sin a tenth of an ephah of the finest flour for a sin offering. They must not put olive oil or incense on it, because it is a sin offering. They are to bring it to the priest, who shall take a handful of it as a memorial portion and burn it on the altar on top of the food offerings presented to the Lord. It is a sin offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them for any of these sins they have committed, and they will be forgiven. The rest of the offering will belong to the priest, as in the case of a grain offering. And so here we have the offerings for the poor. And again, I mentioned this last week, but this is how we know that Jesus's family was not wealthy, is when he was dedicated at the temple. Mary and Joseph brought 2 birds. And so here, that they could not afford a lamb or a female goat. And so these 2 birds, one of the interesting things is, like, why 2? And they're supposed to burn, like, have one that you can sprinkle blood on like with the goats and the bulls and the ram, like, sprinkle blood on the altar or the horns and all that stuff. But the bird is so small that one is essentially for the sprinkling, and the other one is offered as, like, the whole burnt offering. And so that's why it's 2. That's possibly why it's 2 birds and not just 1 bird. But then, even if they can't afford the birds, there's still a way for people to make a sin offering. And so they are able to bring the wheat or the flour, and finely grained flour, but they can't put any olive oil or incense in it. And part of the reason for that is because the portion of this is going to the priests. And if you put olive oil or incense in it, like, it modifies the olive oil can mess up the flour, but also you can't eat the incense. And so, knowing that the priest is going to have a portion of this offering as a part of their inheritance, they need to make sure that they're not putting incense in it. So these different levels of offering are part of the mercy of God, that he is giving ways for people to worship him equally, rich or poor. The wealth of the individual does not change the principle of sacrifice. Like, a sacrifice is supposed to be costly. And so for the people who are bringing the flour, like, it may not feel like it's as expensive from our perspective. But for them, it is expensive. It is costly because that's how they live. And so they're giving something to the Lord to seek forgiveness. And so the priest is walking them through all of these different elements. So those are the sin offerings. So then let's talk about the guilt offering in verse 14. The Lord said to Moses, when anyone is unfaithful to the Lord by sinning unintentionally in regard to the Lord's holy things, they are to bring to the Lord as a penalty a ram from the flock, one without defect and of the proper value in silver according to its sanctuary shekel. The proper value in silver according to the sanctuary shekel, that's where that 20% increase is. It is a guilt offering. They must make restitution for what they have failed to do in regard to the holy things, pay an additional penalty of a fifth of its value, and give it all to the priests. The priests will make atonement for them with the ram as a guilt offering, and they will be forgiven. If anyone sins and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, even though they do not know it, they are guilty and will be held responsible. They are to bring to the priest as a guilt offering a ram from the flock without defect and of the proper value. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them for the wrong they have committed unintentionally, and they will be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. They have been guilty of wrongdoing against the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, if anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving a neighbor about something entrusted to them or left in their care about something stolen, or if they cheat their neighbor, or if they find lost property and lie about it, or if they swear falsely about such a sin that people may commit, when they sin in any of these ways and realize their guilt, they must return what they have stolen or taken by extortion, or what was entrusted to them, or the lost property they found, or whatever it was they swore falsely about. They must make restitution in full at a fifth of the value to it and give it all to the owner on the day they present their guilt offering. And as a penalty, they must bring to the priest, that is to the Lord, their guilt offering, a ram from the flock, one without defect and the property and of the proper value. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them before the Lord, and they will be forgiven for any of the things they did that made them guilty. And so here, this is one of the interesting things about the justice system in the law here in the Old Testament is they did not have they had capital offenses, which we will get to later, where it's like, you do this, you deserve to die. But they did not have like a prison system or a jail system. It was always about restitution, make it right. And so they make it right by bringing the altar sacrifice, bringing an altar sacrifice plus 20% of its value, and then bringing back the goods that may have been stolen and giving those back to the person in the presence of the Lord at the tabernacle, plus 20% of its value. And so there's a reparations principle here at effect, and not just a punishment for like going to jail or anything like that. So it's a different system than what we are used to in our American system. And so as they work through these restoration processes, they are doing all of the offerings that we talked about already, and then making it right with the person that they have offended. When it talks about sinning against the holy places or holy objects, committing a violation, this suggests acting unfaithfully or treacherously is what one of the ways we can look at it. It's violating one's obligations in either the judicial or religious sphere. Most often, the root here for this word is used to designate the violation of religious law as a conscious act of treachery against God, who would be the offended party. And so these sins are ultimately what caused the exile, was mistreating the Lord's the Lord's belongings in the temple, essentially. And so you can read about that in Ezekiel 39 and Daniel 9. And so it's a kind of unfaithfulness that is taking lightly the things of God, and God takes his things very seriously. And so that is, we're going to see in just a couple of weeks, or maybe next week, that Aaron's sons are going to take lightly the things of God, and they're actually going to die because of their inappropriate actions with worship in the Lord's sphere in the tabernacle. But the law here so far is saying, like, there's a way to make it right, and so you bring the offering plus 20% if you're doing that. And really, those are the things that priests are the ones who are going to be doing most of the work with the Lord's holy items, and so they would be the ones who are most at risk of misusing those things. So then talking about fraud against neighbors could be taking something, withholding something, or finding property and not telling people that you found it. Like those are all different levels of fraud, and those are given as fines. And so when we think about the juxtaposition of these two things, there's mistreating the Lord's things and then mistreating your neighbor's things. And we get back to when the religious leaders come to Jesus and say, what's the most important law? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so that's getting back to that principle: love God's things, love the ways of God, give God your whole heart, your whole being, and love your neighbor as yourself. Like those two things are still a part of the law, even here, when it looks at like, don't mistreat the Lord's stuff and don't mistreat your neighbor's stuff. And so there's a consistent theme here that we see. Like, we don't have the tabernacle and all of the different elements of the tabernacle, so we don't have a way to misuse those in our day, but the principle remains: love the Lord and love your neighbor. And so we want to make sure that if we're looking through, like, how would we love the Lord in like today, how are we handling the issues that God is calling us to in offerings like tithes and offerings? Are we taking that seriously? Are we bringing God our best, or like Abe or Cain, are we bringing God some? Those kinds of questions are part of that. Like we should be looking to the law as a guide work for how we can honor God today. And then, if we are thinking about how can we make sure that we are respecting our neighbors and taking care of, looking out for each other. So otherwise, you use your neighbor's lawnmower and you break it and you say, I didn't break it, then you are charged the lawnmower plus 20%. So, all right, let's keep going. Verse 8, we're in 6:8 now, right? Sorry. Yes, 6:8. The Lord said to Moses, give Aaron and his sons this command. These are the regulations for the burnt offering. The burnt offering is to remain on the altar hearth throughout the night till morning, and the fire must be kept burning on the altar. The priest shall then put on his linen clothes and linen undergarments next to his body, and shall remove the ashes from the burnt offering that the fire has consumed on the altar, and place them beside the altar. Then he is to take off these clothes and put on others, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a place that is ceremonially clean. The fire on the altar must be kept burning. It must not go out. Every morning, the priest is to add firewood and arrange the burnt offering on the fire and burn the fat of the fellowship offerings on it. The fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously. It must not go out. And so the burnt offerings, there were two burnt offerings that were happening every day. There was a morning offering and an evening offering. And so this would be a lamb or a ram that would be brought every day. And so in the morning, the priest is coming close to, not necessarily the high priest, but one of the priests, Aaron's sons, is coming close to the altar for where the offerings are being burned. So they have to wear their holy garments to take the ashes of the off of the altar, clean it up, and put them next to the altar, and then they can change out of their holy garments to take those ashes outside of the camp to the same place where they're burning the remains of the bull that was taken out to burn as part of the sin offering earlier that we read about. That same place that's ceremonially clean, they would take all those ashes out there. Now, every day, they were also supposed to keep the fire burning all throughout the day. And so that fire that's burning all day long is creating quite a bit of ash from that morning offering, the evening offering. It never goes out, just constantly burning. And so the we're going to see in I'm pretty sure it's next week, the Lord is actually going to light the fire first. They're going to get everything set up, and then they're going to open up the tabernacle for business, and the Lord's going to light the fire by his power. And so that fire that they're keeping burning is God's fire. Like, it's his, like, he's going to start it. And so he's like, keep it going, keep it burning. So they would need to make sure that they always had enough supply of firewood to make sure that the fire would continue. And so that's one of the offering commands that the people are going to have, like, bring firewood to the tabernacle to make sure that the fire is always burning. Verse 14. These are the regulations for the grain offering. Aaron's sons are to bring it before the Lord in front of the altar. The priest is to take a handful of the finest flour and some olive oil together with the incense on the grain offering and burn the memorial portion on the altar as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Aaron and his sons shall eat the rest of it, but it is to be eaten without yeast in the sanctuary area. They are to eat it in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. It must not be baked with yeast. I have given it as their share of the food offering presented to me, like the sin offering and the guilt offering. It is most holy. Any male descendant of Aaron may eat it. For all generations to come, it is his perpetual share of the food offerings presented to the Lord. Whatever touches them will become holy. The Lord also said to Moses, this is the offering Aaron and his sons are to bring to the Lord on the day he is anointed. A tenth of an ephah of the finest flour as a regular grain offering, half of it in the morning and half in the evening. It must be prepared with oil on a griddle. Bring it well mixed and present the grain offering broken in pieces as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. The son who is to succeed him as anointed priest shall prepare it. It's the Lord's perpetual share, and it shall be burned completely. Every grain offering of a priest shall be burned completely. It must not be eaten. And so these offerings are partly the provision for the priest. So this first one, that is some olive oil and the incense that's burned on there, they take a portion and they're able to, without the incense, they're able to eat that in the temple. It is their, or the tabernacle. It's their food. It's their nourishment. It's the sons of Aaron, male descendants of Aaron. It's theirs to eat. But then there's this other part that is completely devoted to the Lord. And so they want to make sure that they are honoring the Lord in that. So verse 19 is talking about this kind of transition offering. The offering was made throughout Israel's generations by the anointed priest. And so this is part of the dedication ritual of the priests. And so it was a continual offering, as in a regular offering, not like every day they're dedicating the priests. It's like when Aaron dies, his son becomes priest. This is what he has to do, this when he is established as the new king, and that offering is not eaten. So it is a part of his ordination. So that's one of the challenges with English, is like regular. We think of it as like normal, but it is more like consistent in this sense. It's more, this is do this regularly. Don't not do this normally, or don't treat it like a everyday thing. It is a continual offering at the ordination. So this part of this is because it is to remind the priests that although they differed from the rest of the Israelites in terms of their function, this is from Sklar in his commentary. They have a different function. They were exactly the same in terms of their desperate need for the Lord and his favor. The priests who remembered this need would be protected from one of the strongest temptations, that being spiritual pride. And so he has to still offer these offerings to humble himself, to say, I am just like every other person in Israel. All right, and then we have one more section, and then we'll have time for questions. The Lord said, verse 24, the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron and his sons, these are the regulations for the sin offering. The sin offering is to be slaughtered before the Lord in the place the burnt offering is slaughtered. It is most holy. The priest who offers it shall eat it. It is to be eaten in the sanctuary area in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. Whatever touches any of the flesh will become holy, and if any of the blood is splattered on a garment, you must wash it in the sanctuary area. The clay pot the meat is cooked in must be broken, but if it is cooked in a bronze pot, the pot is to be scoured and rinsed with water. Any male in a priest's family may eat it. It is most holy. But any sin offering whose blood is brought into the tent of meeting to make atonement in the holy place must not be eaten. It must be burned up. And so the talking about the sin offering and the atonement offering, these different handlings of these things, but also how to clean things that are used in this process. And so if you if something is holy, let me just read this from Sklar again. A most holy sacrifice, the purification offering had to be slaughtered in a holy place, the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered, on the north side of the burnt offering altar. The most holy status meant that the meat and blood had to be treated very carefully. After the fat had been removed and burned, the remaining meat had to be eaten in a holy place, and so the priest would eat it right there. The holiness of the meat and the blood also explains the regulations about the garment and pots. A garment spattered by sacrificial blood had to be washed in a holy place, in the tabernacle, in the sanctuary area. This ensured that the blood of a most holy sacrifice did not enter the profane realm, so it didn't get taken out into the everyday world. And so these holy garments were really meant to be clean and separate. And so they wanted to make sure that all the handling of the blood at all in any of these sacrifices was handled in the tabernacle. So then even looking at, like, if you are preparing meats in the tabernacle or any of these offerings and you are using a clay pot, like, you can't, because clay is porous, the blood from the animal could work its way into the pot, and you're never going to get that scrubbed out. And so you have to just break the pot. That's a one-time use pot. It's never going to be used again for any other purpose. It is only meant to be a wholly used pot. And so, but if it's bronze, you can wash metal and you can scour it really well, but all of that still has to happen in the sanctuary, in the temple area. And so these different regulations about clothes, about pots, all of this is part of the holiness code to make sure that, they're taking these things seriously. So what would happen if a priest accidentally had maybe some blood spattered on the hem of his garment and didn't notice, thought he looked at himself, I look clean, and he walked out into the profane area outside of the tabernacle? That's how a priest might sin unintentionally and not know what he did. And so then he would see what he did and like, oh, I have to make an offering to the Lord. And so he would go back to chapter 5 or chapter 4 and work his way through those different sacrifices. So, all right. So that was a lot of talk about sacrifices, but if there are any questions or thoughts, one of the things that we can do as we read through these kinds of passages is recognize the severity of sin in the Word of God. Like God takes it very seriously, and there's a great cost for sin in these animals that are being sacrificed. But also, the law is meant to be a blessing that the people could see the effects of sin, but then also find freedom and forgiveness and purification from the sin. They were not just left on their own. So, yeah, any thoughts, questions? We went through a lot, but yeah, I'd love to hear from you. No? Wow. You're all are like, I'm ready to not talk about sacrifices so much.
I can just imagine what would we have to sacrifice today. I mean, back in the day, you had lambs and calves, and many people don't have that today.
Right.
I wonder what the sacrifice would be in a modern time.
Well, if you think
that
about
was
like
the case.
if you think about a bull, like a bull is like your tractor, right, Tony? Like
Yeah.
they're doing a lot of the work for you. And
Mhm.
so, like, would we be willing if the Lord said, like, this sin has created great impurity in the community? I need somebody to give their tractor, their heavy farm equipment, burn it all, burn it down. Like take your truck and just set it on fire as a way of saying, like, we recognize you take sin very seriously. And while a truck is not actually alive, like that's like the value of it is like that is that kind of value. So yeah, it still is not anywhere near as like traumatic as a bull being sacrificed, like watching the death of it. Like that's an intense experience, but it's still like a costly thing. So yeah. One of we're going to get to the Passover. We're going to have more talk about Passover in the law. And I think I mentioned this before, but like the regulations around the Passover are they're supposed to like bring the lamb into their house for a week and like live with it, play with it. Like it's going to be a part of their family. And then the night of preparation before Passover, they would bring it into the priests at the temple in Jerusalem in years to come. And the priest would look at the patriarch of the family and say, do you love this lamb? And if they said yes, and the priest believed them, they would then slaughter the lamb right there. Like, it's like, this is your pet. Do you love this animal? And the Passover lamb takes the place to protect the household. So it's something that they impart some human emotion onto as a part of the sacrifice. So there's a depth to it that is more than just, well, just go get a lamb. It's like, no, this lamb is a part of your household for a whole week. You love this thing and you're offering it to the Lord. So yeah. What else? Any other thoughts, questions?
I have a question on this. For these sacrifices, I mean, they went on forever. I am just mind boggled by how many animals were slaughtered.
Yeah, it's a lot.
I mean, you said 2 a day.
Mm-hmm.
And every day except for Sunday.
Well,
or the Sabbath.
The Sabbath. The tabernacle fire was supposed to keep going all the time, and so I don't know if the priests were not actually offering the sacrifices on Sabbath.
Okay.
Like there may have been some exemptions for tabernacle work. But yeah, there was 14 lambs minimum.
Yeah. Insanely crazy much.
Yeah, it was a lot. So, and when we get to the building of the temple and the actual consecration of the temple and the people, Solomon will, sacrifice a lot of animals on that day. But the sacrifice on that day is also a fellowship offering where the people are also being fed. These offerings, most of these offerings are completely burned up as sin offerings, or only the priests are going to eat any of them. But most of it is going to the flames for these that we looked at today. So yeah, but it's a lot. It's definitely a lot. So yeah. Any other thoughts, questions? All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, one of the things to remember today is when we look at what Jesus has accomplished for us, he has completed the sacrificial system. And the book of Hebrews talks about Jesus entering into the most holy place, not with the blood of bulls and rams, but with his own blood. And he sprinkles like that, like the high priest that is working on our behalf for our sins. Like the high priest here would sprinkle the blood on the different elements. Jesus did that for us with his own blood. And then it says, having completed his work, he has sat down. And one of the key pieces here in the tabernacle is there are no chairs. There's nowhere for the priest to sit down in these offerings. The work is never done. But the writer of Hebrews tells us Jesus sat down because the work is done. And so we can take great comfort knowing that we don't have to keep bringing these offerings back and these sacrifices over and over again, but we can be forgiven through his blood on our behalf. So yeah, well, with all that, we will have a little bit more sacrifice talk in the weeks to come. We're going to look at the dedication of the temple. We're going to talk about what makes people impure, unclean animals. There's going to be so much good, fun stuff. Skin disease. Oh, it's going to be great. You guys are going to love it. You're going to learn about leprosy, and like our idea of leprosy and their idea of leprosy are different. It's going to be fun. So, but we will wrap here, and this will we'll just wrap it up at this point, and we'll see you guys next week.
All right. Good
All right,
night.
night.
Night, guys.
Good night.